Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. Today, I'm going to be talking about planning for habitat extremes that are going to be occurring in our gardens. This is the talk that I gave for the gardening volunteers of South Texas last week, and I wanted to record it so that everyone has access to it. Before I get started, a little bit about my background is that I do hold a PhD in zoology, where I focus on landscape ecology and the effects of landscape coverage or landscape heterogeneity on pollinator communities. In addition to that, I have a number of research papers that utilize abiotic weather and climate data to estimate where animals might be found. I also have a degree in botany and a degree in biology, and I've been working in conservation since 2007 across the country. Currently, my job from my day to day is a wildlife biologist, and quite often I'm tasked with reviewing habitat and seeing where endangered or protected species might exist. So all of these things allow me to look at some of the ways that we're creating habitat in our gardens and bring new perspectives, especially as they come from conservation, and ways to facilitate habitat for our wildlife. So I'm going to turn off my camera, switch over to the PowerPoint, and we'll move on from there. Great. So as we are starting to create habitat for wildlife in suburban and urban environments, maintaining those habitats for wildlife comes with its issues, including the extremes of weather. So for this talk, we're going to start with what climate extremes are and then talk about climate change, because climate change is going to be changing the types of climate extremes that exist in each habitat. Then we'll move on to ecological succession and natural habitats, talk about some of the personal actions we can do inside of our gardens. We'll end with a discussion on broader actions, and then this was open for questions and discussions, and I'll cover some of the questions that were asked during this presentation. So what are climate extremes? And the best definition for a climate extreme is the normal limits that exist for an abiotic factor that affects the entire area. One of the best illustrated climate extreme is done with the USDA hardiness map, which shows the typical winter lows in an area. And these are the temperatures that animals and plants and other biota have to survive or be able to survive to continually persist in an area. Healthy habitats are going to have resources and organisms that are able to survive these limits, and in many cases need to be exposed to something near those limits to continue their life cycle and respond to the environment correctly. Climate change, on the other hand, is starting to shift these patterns, and although we are expecting a warmer overall climate in any area, and this includes having later first frosts, it means more days with above freezing temperatures and less nights with freezing temperatures. It also is going to bring new extremes and new records. So when we're talking about cold weather, as the polar ice caps start to warm and the areas up there get hotter, this destabilizes one of the jet streams that keeps the cold air around the pole. When that's destabilized, we get these new extreme records setting lows, and quite often talked about as the polar vortex. This is going to lead to mortality events, and it already has, for the record. So we're looking at the United States in 2021. There was a polar vortex that heavily impacted the majority of the country, sending negative temperatures throughout much of the Great Plains and dropped a lot of areas to record lows. If we look at the new USDA hardiness map zone, though, here in Texas, we're expecting to see temperatures of 0 in the winter just here in the north portion of the panhandle. However, if you look at the 2021 dates, we saw 0 to -5 Fahrenheit temperatures reach all the way down to the southern border of New Mexico almost. Right after this event happened, I was tasked with doing some vegetation surveys in West Texas and was finding many different types of cactus were unable to survive that were already at the northern limits of their range. A week later, I was sent down to Corpus Christi and also got to see the impacts of this storm on the Gulf Coast animals, especially the ones that live in the water and aren't adapted in any way, shape, or form to experience such lows. In the summer, we're going to see climate change increase our summer highs and prolong that heat as well. So again, overall, we're going to see warmer temperatures. We're going to see that later first frost. We're going to see more days with excessive heat. And something that we're starting to realize is a huge problem is more nights with record high temperatures. So animals aren't able to cool off, and the ground isn't able to cool off the way that it typically did in the past. Climate change is also going to bring changes to our precipitation patterns. We're expecting that we are going to see more and more drought, but it's unclear in the direction of the overall rainfall. And this is partially due to the arid west is expected to dry out a little bit. But in areas where in regions of the United States and the world where we aren't sure how the rain is going to change, or we might see the same amount of annual rainfall, we are expecting to see more dry days between rain events, which means there are going to be less rain events. And that means there has to be more rain per event, which then leads to localized flooding. And in addition to all this, we're expecting to see more extreme years, which means habitats, ecosystems, and species are not going to have the same amount of time to kind of repopulate areas after a disaster wipes through. So if we take an extremely oversimplified look at what influences the range of an animal or a plant or any other organism, we can make up a hypothetical observation like this. From those observations, we can estimate a range, and the areas that a species is able to inhabit is best to think about as having an existence between ranges. So in some areas of the population, like in the north, those animals, if they make a mistake, or those plants, if something happens, they're most likely going to die from a winter cold. Or in the summer, in the southern populations, those summer temperatures might be the leading cause of mortality if there was a mistake. So we have to look at what's kind of pushing the range into its polygon that exists. And understand that there are many different factors that are going to be that limit set. But if we just use 4 major ones, we can kind of get a picture of what we are seeing and understand how ranges might be changing. So every abiotic factor is going to have a limit that an animal can persist in or a plant can persist in. This includes the temperature range, the precipitation range, wind speeds, coverage, all these different things matter. And with future range models that were published early on in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of models showed that many species would have some changes in their range, but it would mostly just shift a little bit. Some of them had growing overall ranges, some of them had shrinking overall ranges, but for the most part, we were seeing simple shifts in these models. However, as we're starting to look at real-world data and understand how animals are going to be responding and plants are going to be responding, we aren't going to be seeing a shift like this because those extremes are still going to be coming in. So that polar vortex, which dropped new low temperatures, that's going to shrink the northern boundary. The excessive heat in the south is going to push it north. And what instead we're noticing is that, or expecting to see, is that ranges for most organisms are going to be shrinking. Now, again, part of the research that I have done and published, a lot of it has relied on analyses that utilize this climate data to estimate where animals might be existing. And that's where this portion of the talk is coming from, that I do have expertise in this area and I'm not just somebody kind of repeating what everyone else is saying, and why I want you all to be very, very aware that as we are planning for future extremes, we shouldn't be trying to create habitat for organisms that are already on the edge of their range, but maybe focus more on the ones that were in the central area of their range, just so we can build a more resilient habitat, especially when it comes to vegetation communities. So with climate change, some of the things that we can do is make sure that we're selecting plants based on recent record lows and not the new USDA hardiness zone. We want to make sure that we're focusing on organisms with ranges extending in all cardinal directions of where we are working. And try to make sure that they will already be acceptable of the habitats that we're working in. Like if you don't have a forest, you wouldn't be trying to promote forest species in your area. Like that's the rationale we're going for here. And then of course provide key microhabitats. So a quick introduction into habitat succession is understanding that although plant succession does start from that herbaceous plant community and in forested areas climaxes in a forested ecosystem when no major disturbances happen, when that major disturbance does occur in a forest, it leaves behind a lot of non-floral resources or non-living resources that a number of wildlife have adapted and evolved to utilize in their life cycles. So if we take a model that looks like this and think about the way the habitat should be moving, when there is a meadow in a forested ecosystem, there should be a lot of standing dead wood, as well as roots and trunks and things under the ground. Most people, when they're focusing on their gardens, typically select open kind of habitats, are meadows, open savannas, and forest edge. If we zoom in on that area within the habitat succession, we can see that the wood would be degrading over time, and that's breaking down here. Plants would be able to establish and grow, and then we maintain this however we see fit. And that's going to lead to a few problems. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Similarly, that model does not include all of the animals that should be present in these ecosystems, and in most cases, no matter where you go in the country, have been extirpated or their numbers have been severely decimated. These animals are important because they are browsing plants, they're spreading seeds, they're influencing nutrient cycles. A lot of burrowing animals are creating shelters. Some of these animals even create shelters by the way that they modify the vegetation community. Some of these animals influence the disturbances of fire by creating fire breaks, creating wetlands, and even providing disturbance on vegetation and snow removal, which allows winter organisms to access the soil and continue to search for soil invertebrates and seeds. Now, this might sound really daunting and terrible and the world is going to end, but the good news is there's a lot of ways that we can plan for this and we can help out. So please don't take this as a end of the world, doomsday event, which we definitely need to be aware climate change is bad and is going to create some drastic changes to our lives. But we also need to know that there are ways that we can improve our current situation so that things are not as extreme as they could be. Going back to that model, if we see current management strategies in practice, like happening in this meadow, which is in New York, the meadow in this picture has been maintained as a meadow for a while. It has prevented any of the woody encroachments that would happen, but we're also missing all of the major animals that should be existing in this area, including black bears, some of the moose, and even bison should have made it out here at some point in time. Animals disturb that snowbank and allow birds to continue to find seeds in the soil. They also end up creating snowbanks that allow animals to access hollowed out areas where there is simply more insulation from the environment, especially wind breaks when the wind chill is really bad. So one of the first things that we can do when it snows is make sure that we're clearing some of the clearing the snow over our soil so that birds can continue to forage. Inside of areas where animals are present, we can also see the influence they have on the habitat. Here on the left is a picture of bison on Catalina Island. No, they are not supposed to be there, but we can see that they've continued to remove shrubs from the areas that they typically inhabit. They also lay down, they smash vegetation down. This helps plants regrow in those areas because they're not growing through all that shaded area. They instead have a pretty quick access to full sun. On the right, what we're looking at is a floodplain forest that 3 years ago had beavers in it. Beavers went and removed the majority of the saplings when they were feeding. They killed just a few trees, so there's some nice snags for birds to be foraging on, various insects to be living in, and new nesting and perching places for a number of other organisms. Similarly, once this area drained, it's now opening up for a new vegetation community that's growing out in dappled shade. So when we're looking at our environments that we're managing and understanding how microhabitats might form in the wild, it's important to then consider which animals we're trying to create habitat for in the first place. And we can do that by simply asking, is there shelter for the winter stages of this animal's life? Is there summer shelter for this animal? Are there microhabitats that they need for their life cycle, like amphibians need standing bodies of water for a bit of time? Do they have appropriate nesting sites? And then, of course, if they are predators, which many of our frogs and birds are, is there prey habitat, is there prey, and is there food present? Also asking where are organisms going during the weather extremes is important, and quite often we forget that the burrowing animals that we don't want in our suburban environments are key ecosystem engineers providing shelter for a lot of organisms that cannot burrow. So we need to provide spaces that are underground for animals to access when it's too hot and when it's too cold. So when we're looking at overwintering strategies, we can ask ourselves where can we find these animals in winter? And there are a number of animals that are quite active in the winter, including many mammals, some insects, and many of the birds that stay over. A lot of amphibians overwinter as adults underground. A number of insects overwinter as adults, but also at some point during their life stage, depending on the species. Some moths and some insects overwinter as eggs, some overwinter as pupa, some overwinter in different instars. So it's important to understand which stage of their life they're overwintering in and where they carry that out. So to start off with, let's talk about extreme cold and things that we can do. And the first thing that we can make sure that is provided in our habitat is an insulated shelter. For example, when we're talking about many of the saturnids, including Luna moths and Cecropia moths, there might be a few generations through the year, and then in the winter, when that species is getting ready to overwinter, the animals find a safe, secure place that has, for the Luna moth specifically, leaf piles that they then sew together. But they want to make sure the area is dry enough, but not too dry. They want to make sure it's insulated so they don't get blown away. And you'll typically find these underneath shrubs with very close branches to the ground, downed branches where the leaves have been trapped, or even hollow logs and other woody structures that are heavy and going to keep those leaves present throughout the winter. With climate change, making sure that our leaf piles are thick enough that when it freezes, it's still going to stay within the correct limits for these animals to survive is going to be key. Another way that we can provide shelters for organisms is to understand where they would be and what might be missing from our landscape. So in this photo, we're looking at some garden beds that are being installed where there's vegetation, food plot right in the front, some perennial pollinator-friendly plants in the back, but there's not really any of the materials that should exist in an herbaceous community in a forested landscape. So because we're missing that root structure underneath the ground that should be decaying or creating hollows that animals can access, we can simply mimic it in the best way possible. An easy option is to take a space that is going to be covered but has some decent airflow, dig out about 18 inches, depending on where you're at. If you're in places like Vermont or Maine where your frost line goes even further down, you want to dig deeper than 18 inches. Fill it with mulch that has not been treated with chemicals. And then you can put in a little bit more soil in here just to facilitate the insulation or the permeability of this space. Once you fill it in with those materials, you can cover it back over. And again, it looks the same. You're not really seeing any difference to your landscape, but now you're providing shelter for animals to seek out. And this works for both the summer and the winter. Now we take a side cut of this and look into the soil where we've dug down and filled it with that mulch. Again, you want to make sure it's below that frost line, and depending on where you're at in the country is going to affect how deep that frost line is going to be. Luckily, there are a number of organizations that track what the frost line is, so you simply have to Google your location and frost line to find out how deep you need to go. Other shelters that animals will quite often seek out they might not be able to create themselves are burrows. And these are easiest to establish inside of raised beds, but you can also put them in the ground. You want to make sure that hideaways have sturdy walls and a sturdy ceiling so they don't collapse. For areas that are going to be in the full sun, make sure they are covered by at least 18 inches or more of soil. And this is to prevent those spaces from cooking in the sun. Similarly, in the winter, we want to make sure it's below the frost line. And then anything that has a tunnel, make sure that those tunnels are at least 2 inches larger than your target wildlife. It is important to understand that just because you make an area for a specific species of wildlife, it does not mean that species of wildlife will utilize that space. In fact, many wildlife will probably utilize it. We simply want to create decent habitat that the animals we want to promote in our areas to be able to utilize if they so choose, but we cannot force them to do it. An additional step to this is, when possible, add loose soil or organic material to the bottom of the tunnels or the caverns that you create, and this will allow animals to just bury in a little bit more and insulate themselves as they find appropriate. Above ground shelters, quite often we put these into our yards and not really think about how they should exist in the natural environment. And bee hotels, bird boxes, shelter boxes, etc., are a good example of those resources that we're not really considering how they should exist in the wild. We want to make sure that there are natural materials available, like leaves, hair, feathers, etc., that animals can then pack into these spaces to create insulation. If you put up a brand new bird box in the fall and you're hoping animals will overwinter in there, go ahead and stuff it with leaves and fur as well, because animals won't necessarily make the nest, but they will utilize it when they find it. Above ground shelters also include the way vegetation stands should exist. So back when megafauna were able to roam open areas and trample things down, it would create walls of vegetation like this. And then when snow happens, it collects on the top, but there's now an insulated igloo type shaped event here where animals are able to escape, continue to forage for seeds and insects, and also escape the wind chill, the rain, and the snow. If you are lucky enough to have a large acreage, keep areas under roofs open for owls and other foraging animals, and make sure there's a flight path. Many owls will continue to hunt in these areas, even if they aren't barn owls. So it's an easy enough thing to do if you have the space. So if we look at our gardens in winter and understand how the temperature and vegetation and animals are all working together, anywhere that snow starts to accumulate, that works as an insulator to prevent it from getting even colder when temperatures drop below 0 Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Vegetation creates structure that snow can fall on and provides areas for fossorial organisms that are going to run across the ground surface, spaces to move around as well. Having stones, logs, and standing snags also work as insulators to prevent those areas underneath them from getting cool. Larger diameter logs are going to be able to cool on the outside, but the interior of that log will have a more stable temperature than the areas near the surface. Spaces underground that animals will seek out to spend the winter also will insulate in different ways depending on what's above them or how deep they are. The last thing to consider is the material that animals are hibernating in the cold. So sandy soils are going to cool off faster than clay soils, but they're also going to warm up faster. They have less thermal insulation. Similarly, organic material is going to allow for microorganisms to continue to break it down. That in itself creates a metabolic process that heats the area up a little bit more than the surrounding area, and it's quite often one of the reasons that it's sought out by overwintering organisms. And when we go out into our yards, sometimes it's very hard to see if the steps that we are taking are working, but there quite often will be signs that even though you're not seeing the animals, you can see their tracks in the snow to know that you are creating really good habitat. During extreme colds, the other thing that we can do is provide liquid water. Animals have the ability to die of dehydration, especially when everything is frozen. In our urban and suburban environments, we typically don't have large, clean, temporary winter water resources, or those resources in the summer and fall either. The best way to recreate these resources is to create shallow basins with rough edges to allow animals to grab onto and crawl out if they fall in. Place them in full sun in the winter and use dark rocks or dark materials to help absorb solar heat to allow it to melt. You can also use heated pumps depending on where you're at. In some situations, it's a good idea to provide deep water that won't freeze as well, especially for amphibians that like to spend the winter underneath. Similarly, in areas where it doesn't freeze that often, like we see here in Texas, a number of reptiles like turtles will spend that cool temperature in the water and then come out and bathe in the sun once it's warm and daylight again. We also want to make sure we're providing food during extreme events, especially in the winter. Many gardeners provide suet in the winter, and this is for birds. But if you think about it, it's a little bit odd to provide animal fat for animals that don't typically ingest, vertebrates. And the reason that we do this is because we have removed predators from our landscape. We've also removed a lot of the soft-bodied organisms that would still be active in the winter that these birds would feed on. So by providing suet, we're replicating the carcasses that would be left over by wolf packs, by many of our larger predators, as well as providing resources that supplement the lack of like termite mounds or ant colonies that would live in large tree snags. It's also important to plant species of plants that are going to produce berries in the winter. Of course, incorporate dead wood and standing snags for the insect foragers because it provides habitat for those insects to stay busy. Seed feeders are a great example, and then again, exposed soils are important. Some of the shrubs that you can add to your yard are listed here, depending on where you're at, that will provide berries in the winter. Along with these extreme cold events, we're also going to be seeing extreme heat events in the winter, and this is starting to create a mismatch of pollinators. Where I live out in West Texas right now, I've been going out and surveying bees as soon as it's above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, any day that it's above 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And these are some of the species that we've collected in that study. We're supplementing this with a floral resource survey when we go out, and that involves searching the entire area for at least 1,000-meter transects, looking for any plants that are in bloom. And typically what we're finding is that red-stemmed storksbill, Texas storksbill, and dandelions are the main flowers in bloom. There are some cases some outlets, I should say, that really vilify the dandelion. Because it's not native, I understand that, but it is not invasive. It really only occupies areas that we disturb and really are mowed areas when it comes to that. They do not outcompete any of our native flora. So, when we're looking at the ability to feed our animals that might be mismatched because of weather extremes, dandelions have had this whole group of bees collected on their flowers. There are a few studies that look at dandelions as an appropriate food source for bees and have found that if you feed generalist species dandelions for a long period of time, they don't do well. But this would be akin to feeding yourself crackers for a full 4 or 5 months and then wondering why you have nutrient deficiencies. So the reality is that dandelions do provide some level of food source that are going to prevent these animals from starving, but it should absolutely not be the only food source that is provided. If you live in an area where there are native plants that are going to produce flowers on these warm days right after a freeze, definitely encourage those as well. But for the most part, there are very few plant species that can do that, and the only ones that I have found so far are dandelions and red storksbill. So consider including these flowers in any spaces that are mowed or any spaces that are kept clear. During record droughts and heat, again, we want to provide water. Water is used for drinking and cooling. as well as creating habitat. So if you have leaf piles or mulch piles, wetting those down in extreme droughts every 2 or 3 weeks, or however your rain pattern would typically keep them wet, is going to be important. This does not mean you want to go out and water everything every day or even once a week if that's not what's supposed to be happening in your environment. Utilizing water from roof runoff or hard surfaces and rain barrels is a good option for this type of supplementation. And then, of course, create damp areas where animals can cool off. Typically, in taller vegetation, you'll find birds go under there because of transpiration. So if you have those in your yard as well, make sure that those areas are receiving enough water to keep it cool for animals to escape the heat. If you have the space and the time, of course, providing bodies of water that animals can carry out their life cycle can be important as well. Droughts are, of course, supposed to happen historically, but because we're already looking at so much habitat loss and so much change with climate change coming down, or expecting to change in the near future, trying to lessen these events is our best course of action. In the summer, we also want to make sure that shelter is provided. We want to include shady places where animals can escape the heat and escape the sun. Typically, this is done in burrows, underneath plants, and we can install these in our yards as well. Nest boxes are a good option. In some cases, it might be good to add a secondary shade structure on the nest box so that it doesn't bake too much. Plants with large leaves create secluded areas that animals can feel safe in, that hold the water, keep temperatures down, and will be sought out by a number of different wildlife. Including spaces between rocks, especially ones on the ground, that animals can scurry under is going to be important as well. Typically, when rocks are installed in our landscapes, they're installed securely so that there really isn't much room for animals to get under, because they want the rock to not shift. If that is the case, simply excavating a small area that the animals can escape into is going to be important for the wildlife in your area. With drought, we're also expecting floods. And the way to plan for that is to borrow some of the infrastructure that we already utilize in civil engineering, creating areas that will purposefully hold water and direct water to those areas will help alleviate our systems so that they're not getting inundated by all the precipitation in the area. Holding this water for longer periods of time will also create spaces for many of our animals that need water for their life cycle. This can be done by creating rain gardens and areas that tolerate standing water from roof runoff, from driveway runoff, or any other hard surface. In addition to doing that, we want to make sure there are upland areas for animals to escape to. And in some cases, depending on where you're at, the whole area might be expected to flood in a 100-year flood event. Typically, you can find those areas on the FEMA flood maps. And insurance companies typically make sure that you have understood where you sit in those floodplains for their risk analysis, but also to see what kind of coverage you need. Throughout the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast, we can see a lot of infrastructure that has been developed that is aesthetically pleasing, but also provides spaces for animals to escape when waters get too high. So here we're looking at an area that drains a park. And there are plants in the low parts of this area that are going to do just fine when they're inundated with water. This space can fill up and then fill into the drains. But there are a lot of areas around this area that's going to pond where animals can escape and get out of that water so that they can continue to live and not drown. Similarly, if you're in an area that's prone to droughts, crevice gardens are starting to take off, which aligns rocks vertically to help direct water into the soil and roots down deeper. And this helps the plants have water available to their roots for longer periods of time because that water is not lost by evaporation as quickly. If you're interested in designing a crevice garden, there are a number of tutorials online. I highly recommend looking into them. So, from this, I hope you all are able to understand that areas will experience more record-setting weather, and it's important that we're promoting organisms, especially vegetation, with ranges in all cardinal directions. We want to make sure that we're providing adequate resources and microhabitats that will help wildlife survive. This includes shelters for winter and summer, water in both winter and summer, refuge from these extreme events, and from any of the events that might simply harm them. And then, of course, making sure that we're providing food. When possible, we want to imitate actions of missing wildlife. This includes creating burrows, clearing snow, and trimming plants so that animals can find those microhabitats that they're looking for. In addition to our actions that we can do in our gardens, it's important to understand that there are other actions that are going to have bigger impacts. Part of this is supporting policy overhauls and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Quite often we're told about our personal carbon footprint, but in reality, if we aren't limiting what industry is able to do or what the different groups are allowed to do, it's really not going to be the impact that we want it to be. There's also a reality that there's a false balance in news coverage where journalists are quite often trying to do both side-isms without explaining that a handful of experts that have spent their careers studying something definitely have a more informed opinion than somebody who witnessed a flood and has a feeling about it. So when both side-ism is presented, it's quite often presented as equal weight arguments, but that should never be the case. We need to be listening to scientists. It's important to support appropriate green infrastructure. This means pairing our wind farms with agriculture, pairing our solar farms with agriculture or urban development. It does not mean going out and bulldozing intact habitats so that a solar farm can be put in for a company to go benefit from and charge us for that energy. And last, make sure that you're listening to scientists and, again, consume information carefully, because even though there are many, many journalists out there with very good integrity, when they start presenting the both side-isms, it starts to muddy the waters and leads to people not understanding why climate change is such a big deal. And with that, I would gladly take questions and discussions. If you're watching this video, feel free to reach out to me on email or on LinkedIn. Some of this information is covered in my current book, Inviting Pollinators and Other Wildlife into Your Garden. And a lot of it will be covered in my next book called Habitats and Homes, A Conservation Approach for Gardens, which we're expecting to be published by 2025. When I was presenting this in Texas earlier last week, some of the questions that were asked included, when are we going to see climate change kind of plateau and live in the new norm? And the reality is, we're not. There's no way in our lifetime, and I'm talking about a baby born today, in their lifetime, the amount of damage we've done to our planet will continue to play out and ripple through the ecosystems in our climate throughout their life. And that is if we were to stop producing and increasing our greenhouse gases today. The only reality that I hope people are able to take away from this is that we definitely need to start acting and understand that if we don't, we can easily turn our planet into Venus, which is uninhabitable by humans. And I know none of us want that to happen. It is a little bit harder to wrap our heads around because it's taking decades for this to establish. And it's really looking into the future. But most people seem to be able to wrap their heads around that and understand that this is dangerous. So we need to make sure that we are electing politicians that are going to act and that we are holding people accountable for the destruction that's happening to our planet. Another question that was asked was providing food for animals in winter. Is that going to facilitate disease spread or really mess up any of the migration? The answer to that question is Yes, providing food for organisms at any point in time has the potential to spread diseases. And this is because animals that are sick can utilize that resource, and then animals that are not sick can utilize those resources and get infected. By simply spreading resources out across the landscape and making sure that any of the structures that are providing that food are cleaned up on a regular basis, like you would a dog bowl or a bird bath, that's going to reduce the amount of spread of diseases. As far as it comes to affecting migrating animals, climate change and weather patterns are going to affect migration, and animals are going to be disrupted. So in some very few cases, you might be confusing an animal to stick around, but for the most part, animals are listening to abiotic signals and responding to those. So providing food at least allows animals getting confused by the signals that are being sent by the climate a way to survive it. This includes providing nectar for hummingbirds. This includes providing dandelions for bees. It includes providing oats for mammals. So it's okay to provide food as long as you're not breaking any local laws and trying to spread those resources out so that diseases are not being contracted very quickly. With that, thank you so much for paying attention in this video. If you have any questions, please again feel free to reach out. And I wish you all the best with your garden.